Dear Scare Mail, before we get started, I'd just like to warn you, what you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing abductions ever recorded. Simply because on October night in 1973, two men by the names of Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker encountered mysterious beings that had never been seen before. These were no mere gray aliens. They were far bigger in stature. Their motives are unknown, and even more worrisome, there is new evidence that implies they may still be lurking here to this very day. But who are these mysterious creatures, and what do they want? What became of Charles and Calvin? And most importantly, how can they still be hiding here after all this time? Join me as we cover all of this and more, along with the bombshell new evidence regarding the Pascagoula Abduction. But first, what's up guys? My name's Andrew and I run the Scare Mail channel. I want to start out by saying that I need your help. You see, you're going to be learning a lot of new information in this video, so stick around to the end because I want to hear what you have to say. As always, if you like ghosts, cryptids, aliens, and other supernatural stories, then be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel with bell notifications to ensure your Scare Mail continues to get delivered. Without further ado, let's get on with the story. October 11th, 1973. It was a peaceful fall night as 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 19-year-old Calvin Parker finished up another busy workday at the shipyard. Charles was a well-respected foreman who recently started mentoring Calvin, and he figured what better way to bond with his new co-worker than with some late-night fishing. Only, the two men didn't know it at the time, but they would be the ones being caught like fish that fateful night. Eager to get started, the two men rushed out to a nearby dock on the Pascagoula River in Mississippi at around 7 p.m. and promptly set up their equipment, relaxing as they kicked back and cast out their fishing lines while sipping on some whiskey. A couple hours passed and the guys even caught a few fish to spruce up their mood before things went horribly wrong. As they were getting ready to pack up, the men noticed an ominous blue light floating down the river, brightly reflecting off the water. Charles told Calvin not to worry though, for it was likely just the sheriff coming to check up on the two fishermen. Only, it wasn't. To their surprise, the light grew brighter and brighter until it was hovering over top their very heads. They tried to make out what the object was, but the light was simply too bright. But eventually, the lights began to flicker, revealing what appeared to be an egg-shaped metallic craft slowly descending towards them. Charles wasn't moving, but Calvin's initial reaction was to scream and run for help, until he had the terrifying realization he was unable to move as well. The two men now found themselves frozen in place. After this realization, the craft now hovered before them as a door, seemingly appearing out of nowhere, began to open, and what would emerge would scar the men forever. Now emerging from the craft were three large beings, wearing what appeared to be rippled metallic suits. They stood over 6 feet tall with limbs as thick as tree trunks, with their legs seemingly fused together. Their faces were even stranger, with pointy protrusions where their noses and ears should be, along with no eyes of any kind. The men struggled to move as the beings hovered towards them, holding out their crab-like claws as they gripped the men's arms. Suddenly, Charles and Calvin were overcome by a great sense of euphoria and peace, almost like they had been drugged. During this intense sensation, Charles looked down to see that they were now floating over the water and straight into the craft. Once inside, Hickson and Parker were blinded by an incredibly bright light before being separated, taken to different rooms by the mysterious creatures. The men were completely defenseless, finding themselves in some sort of dreamlike state as they were laid out on tables. There, the beings subjected the men to strange experiments, including scanning their bodies with a strange machine, along with injecting them with some mysterious unknown fluid. Charles could see the needle protrude from the being's claw, holding it above his face as it slowly lowered downward. He tried to struggle, he tried to scream, he tried to run, but it was no use. Charles watched as the needle lowered downward until... Unexpectedly, Charles and Calvin now found themselves back on the dock alone, with no sign of the ship ever being there. The two men immediately broke down, traumatized by the harrowing event. They questioned what they should even do next, considering what they just experienced was too extraordinary for anyone to believe. But despite this, the two made the decision to drive down to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office to immediately report what had happened. Sometime later, Sheriff Fred Diamond and Captain Glenn Ryder were surprised to see two men hysterically barge into the office during their night shift. The two men immediately began trying to explain their fantastic case, continually talking over each other. Encouraging the men to slow down and remain calm, Sheriff Diamond promptly invited them into an interrogation room to explain their case. Once in there, the police separated both Hickson and Parker in order to get their individual sides of the story, and, to their surprise, their stories lined up. However, the sheriff and captain were still skeptical of the entire ordeal and invited them all in one room together to see if they could draw out any inconsistencies. Once there, the two men reiterated their frightening tale and begged the officers for help, hoping they would investigate the matter. The officers told the two men to sit tight as they stepped outside the room for a little break. But what Charles and Calvin didn't know was that the officers left a recorder on one of the seats, hoping the two men would reveal a hoax while the officers were away. But to their surprise, Hickson and Parker discussed their shock and trauma with the whole ordeal.
The Air Force and all know it's up there too, see. And this ain't gonna be the only time. It's gonna happen again. Until they...
Well, she's almost had a heart attack tonight, ain't she?
Well, I know.
I come one down each
I know
day.
it scared me to death too, so...
I'm just laying there crying right now. I can't tell
I know that...
After this, the sheriff and captain had no choice but to believe the two fishermen. But this raised a very important question. What are we even supposed to do about this? Well, the next goal was to find potential witnesses, which meant it was time to go public. After the release of the story, a media storm immediately overtook Charles and Calvin's personal lives, which brought even more stress to an already traumatic situation. Charles was even accused of being an alcoholic, and drinking whiskey on the night of the encounter didn't help his case very much. With Calvin withdrawing from the public eye due to all the harassment, it was becoming obvious that all of Pascagoula was starting to turn against the two men, until multiple witnesses came to their aid. It turns out on the night of the abduction, multiple phone calls to the police were recorded involving mysterious blue lights in the night sky. But that wasn't all they got that night, for even more reputable sources would come forward with information. Mike Cataldo, a member of the United States Coast Guard, was on patrol that night nearby when he saw something shocking. A bright blue light emerged from the water about a mile from his location before hovering off towards the Pascagoula River. This gave even more credit to Hickson and Parker's story and completely shifted the media's perception of the situation from a hoax to reality. Years later, another witness nearly cemented the story as fact when a woman by the name of Maria Blair came forward. Maria recalled being at a drive-in diner across the street from the river when she saw a mysterious blue light hovering above the water. She tried to get her husband's attention, but before he could even look up from his dinner, the craft had vanished. Vindicated by these new testimonies, one would think everything would change for the better for Charles and Calvin. But, sadly, that wouldn't be the case, at least for some time. Like many survivors that have come forward, Charles and Calvin would end up being ridiculed for the rest of their lives. Charles developed blood pressure issues along with anxiety, which he developed from having to constantly defend his story from hostile locals. Meanwhile, Calvin had to deal with depression and nightmares of the fateful night for the rest of his life. He even struggled to hold a job and had trouble socializing due to the stigma around the incident. But that didn't mean the two couldn't make some good out of a bad situation. You see, Charles would go on to release a book along with advocating for UFO research until his death in 2011, and in that time span became well respected amongst his peers. And despite shying away from the public eye for many years, Calvin would go on to release a book of his own recounting the chilling incident. However, like anything else, this story has become less and less prevalent over time, but I regret to inform you that the story doesn't end here. Surprisingly, Recent events have taken place that lead me to believe that these terrifying beings are not only still here, but have been in hiding this entire time. And if you don't believe me, check out this video from just 3 years ago.
Officials from the Federal Aviation Administration say there were no aircraft incidents or accidents in this area Tuesday night, but multiple witnesses report seeing a large blue object fall out of the sky and into the ocean. Not long after, a woman named Mariah spotted the same thing passing over Princess Kahanu Estates.
What did I look up? And then I was like, oh.
As interesting as this may be, that's not all I have for you today. Check out this recent video by a group of fishermen in Puerto Rico from just last year.
Mira, empezó en el puente y está en la boya, mira la boya. El puente está a mano izquierda, a mano izquierda. Mira eso, mira eso, mira. Mira eso. ¿Hay algo ahí? Mira algo ahí. Míralo. Yo no sé qué carajo es eso, dale para atrás. Si no quieres saber. Dale. Dale.
Did you see that? Let's watch that again.
Mira eso. ¿Hay algo ahí?
A figure abruptly emerges from the water, but it doesn't appear to be swimming. It looks as if it's floating out of the water. But before we have a chance to see more, the fishermen panic and immediately ride away, which, in my opinion, was a very wise decision. And look, I'm sure you're wondering how any of this relates to the Pascagoula incident, but isn't it obvious? The bright blue lights of both the UFO and USO fit the description of what Charles and Calvin saw perfectly, and not to mention both objects were seen in and around the water, just like in Pascagoula. Even so, whether or not you believe these incidents involve the same creatures as the ones in Pascagoula, there's no denying that the similarities are interesting to say the least. And if you still don't believe, well, I don't blame you very much. I like to think of myself as a skeptic too, but the more I research these chilling tales, the more I realize scary stories have never been more real. So, before you go, I'd like to leave you with this. If you find yourself out in the water and you see a bright blue light, run while you still can, because if you don't, you just may find yourself aboard an alien ship with a needle in your face. Well, I hope you enjoyed this week's Scare Mail, guys, because I had a lot of fun researching this one. And as a reminder, I'd love to know your thoughts on everything you learned in this video. Is it a hoax? Is it bogus? Or are you starting to believe there's something else out there? If so, comment down below because I'd love to hear your feedback. And to those of you watching, subscribing, and continually supporting me, thank you, because y'all are the ones that keep me going. I look forward to making many more videos for all of you to enjoy. And if you're looking for more creepy alien stuff, check out my video on the Luis Sergio Pacheta abduction right here, because that one is pretty crazy too, and I'm hoping you'll enjoy it. Until next time, thanks for watching, and good night.